Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Ritual of Wild after taking a little break from the holiday season. I am so honored and excited to have Kris González here with me. She is the founder of the Way of Yin, as well as one of the facilitators and founders of Womb School. And she is someone that has been very instrumental on my own path of inquiry as I learn to cultivate relationship with my body. Kris, welcome to Ritual of Wild. I'm so just really honored that you're here.
Thank you so much for the invitation. It felt like such a gift, like the right timing. Yeah, so thanks for
Yes,
having me.
I'm so glad you're here. And I was really tuning into sort of the frequency of the conversation before we came and sat here together. And the thing that came up for me the most, and maybe it's just me or the change of season, but I'm still feeling like we're in the belly of the winter womb. And I don't know if it's like motherhood for me, but I'm like day 5 of my bleed. So I should be on an upswing of like feeling into now my follicular, but I have a lot of grief. I'm feeling a lot of grief in my chest, a lot in my throat, and I feel like that wants to take up a little bit of space in our conversation today. And I was wondering, from your perspective as a Chinese medicine practitioner, if there is any resonance in the winter, I believe it's water right now, the water element, if there's any resonance with grief. Because when I think of water and what that represents to me, there's fluidity and flow. So I don't know if it's that the grief wants to flow through, or if I myself am experiencing some stagnation or like a collective feeling. But I would love to hear from you what your perspective is as a Chinese medicine practitioner, if there is a correlation or if it's just me.
I would say it's not just you. Yeah, and before we got on the call, you asked me how I was doing, and I was actually, sharing that yesterday was a really big emotional day and that
Mm,
today is a different day. Um, yeah, wintry waters just has this ability, this bigness to be able to hold all the emotions for us. And when you speak of grief, of course, within the five element lens, that's the emotion of autumn. And so it almost feels as if, you know, if the container of autumn didn't feel broad or wide enough,
mm,
that some of that emotion that's kind of carried over from the autumn dips into the water of winter. And there we can kind of explore that emotion more. Yeah, and I feel like it also has to do with where we are individually as
mhm,
far as our life cycles. But of course, as you said, with motherhood, I always think about this article that I read a long time ago about the making and breaking of motherhood and
mm.
how that in itself is such a rite of passage and how it just changes us and how do we show up to those changes as it's like happening in real time
Yeah,
while we're relating to these like small beings. Yeah, so winter is really special to me. I think maybe because of the name of my company, The Way of Yin.
mhm.
The water element is like the ultimate yin. It's that embracing, it's that open arm, it's that net that catches us when we fall. It's that buoyancy that lets us know that we are held even though we feel like we're falling. Yeah.
That's really beautiful. And I love that you said that because it sort of echoes this undertone of a feeling I have that, yes, there is grief here, and yet it also feels welcomed. Whereas a younger version of myself, maybe even just before motherhood, would probably try to avoid or push away the grief. And yet it feels like, as you say that, I'm hearing this notion of like grief is also a change agent. It's also a part of the human experience, and it allows us to look at parts of ourselves that also want our attention. Just like if we were raising a child, our children come with all sorts of emotions, as do every human. And, we would never turn away from their emotions. We would welcome it to help them move through. So thank you for reflecting that nature, the nature of the wisdom of nature and how that could be connected with grief. There was something else you said too about motherhood that I found so beautiful, and just the very big reality of like tending to the hearts that live outside of us that, we created inside our bodies. And I was moving through this ceremony yesterday with one of my teachers, sorry, and her name's Usha Anandi of Woman Wellness, and she shared a quote, and it was like something like, to love someone is to attend 1,000 funerals of who you once were. And that's the grief I'm feeling, just like the very realness of like my baby's growing a little bit older and priorities are shifting, which means parts of myself would have to not necessarily go away, but be prioritized in a different way, just so that I can weave what's so important in their lives right now. And that comes with a lot of grief and a lot of joy. And it just reflects like this duality of life.
I just love the synchronicity of this conversation. That was the bigness that happened yesterday, of just like this realization that my kiddos are not babies anymore, and they have their own minds and feelings and paths that they want to lead. And yeah, I went to, what is this called when it's not a baby shower, but it's like for the mother. It's a ceremony for the mother when they're about to give birth.
Mm.
And um, I remember one of the elders there said that part of being a parent is this like little bits of grief every single day, because there's a realization that you have to let go a little bit every day.
Mm.
And so it's like a heartbreak that you have every
Yes.
single day, because they're growing and they're becoming their own person. Yeah, but I would say that yesterday I realized, I don't know why it's taken 14 years, because my eldest is 14, that we just have like these few more years with him here before he goes off and explores the world on his own. And I just don't know how it happened so quickly.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Yeah. And I can feel like my own tenderness come up as you share that. So I really want to thank you for sharing your heart in this conversation. It's so meaningful. And it reminds me of the conversation I had with Rochelle. And she was saying how, like you think of motherhood as like tending to these babies in diapers and them learning how to walk. But we forget the mothers of teens who are now having to be on this whole other level of like, first of all, your little one coming into their own, who you're always going to see as a baby, and then your own feelings that surface as they learn to take up space in the world. And it doesn't involve you necessarily, because now they might be turning towards peer support or their own personal interests that they've cultivated as a result of like beautiful conscious parenting. And yet there's still this like, ooh, it is. I've read that article. It's like a constant heartbreak. It's like a breakup and then beauty because they come to something on their own. It's so powerful to witness. But yes, it's like, it just feels like this great unraveling where we're constantly being invited to open and let go. And it just feels like such a powerful mirror of life. Is that not like the purpose of life, to constantly love and let
right.
go and love and let go?
Hmm.
Yeah, and just noticing like the presence, like can we be present to that without turning away from it? And I just think it takes a lot of courage to do that. And that's something that I really really loved learning from you. I partook in Kris's certification for maidens and menstruation, and something we explored there was Jing essence. And I never understood this term before, and just how like it starts as early as menarche, right? Which is a woman's first bleed. Am I correct in saying that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hmm.
And, I know you're raising boys, and I have one boy and one girl, but still, it brings to surface the question for me of like how our health is so cumulative, and it can begin as early as way before the first bleed. So I would love it if we could explore what Jing essence is and, how this maybe connects with motherhood, but also how it's so impactful for that moment when a woman or a young girl goes into that rite of passage of experiencing her first bleed.
It feels so perfect that we're in winter, at least in the northern hemisphere, that we can start in water
Mhm.
because that's like the home of ancestral qi and ancestral
Yeah,
jing. Yeah, and that's like the root of us. It's like the densest aspect of us is what we call Jing essence. And you can kind of think of it like DNA, but it's so much more than that. It holds memories. It
mm,
brings everything from your lineage and your ancestors, all of the joys, but also the heartache and the traumas, little t, big T, all of it. And then when you come earth side, that's where you have kind of the second half of your Jing. So you have these two aspects, prenatal and postnatal.
so cool.
And those two together create kind of like this elixir that you live off of for the rest of your life. And it determines the trajectory of your lifespan. And
Interesting.
it's really what drives what's called the 7-year cycles within
Mm,
East Asian medicine. And so it controls your development, your reproductive processes. So it has everything to do with the womb continuum. So I love saying, like, living a Jing centered life. So it would be my wish that everybody learns about their Jing essence. And one manifestation of Jing essence, so that you can bring it to kind of a practical way to engage with it, is your menstrual blood.
mm,
That is a pure manifestation of Jing essence because this is what nurtures every human being on this planet.
yeah.
We were all nurtured in that before we were born. Yeah, and for those of us with female anatomy, we have three golden opportunities to really deeply, deeply care for our Jing essence. And that's through menstruation, really getting to know and relating to our cyclical nature, our kind
Mm,
of infradian monthly rhythms, and really monitoring the quantity, but also the quality of what we're shedding each month.
mhm.
So we almost have this like barometer of health, like our blood pressure and our pulse and temperature. Um, yeah, so if we were to think about our menstrual blood as Jing essence, of course, we don't want to shed too much and too often. And I
Mhm.
think a lot of time what's missing from kind of our wellness map or just the context of our wellness as cyclical bodies, we're not really taught that. We're just kind of told just muscle through it, through the heavy bleeding or bleeding 2 times a month. And oh, that's just part of having a cycle. Where, if we were taught how to relate to our cyclical bodies and that we're shedding a little bit of Jing every single month. And of course, we need that shedding in order to keep the life cycles going, but we don't want to shed too much because that's our life essence.
Mm,
Yeah, and then the other golden opportunity, which marks our greatest Jing allocation, is postpartum. So there's just so much energy allocation that goes into, creating life, not only like the egg, which is also Jing essence, but gestation and the birthing process and feeding our young through breast milk. This is all Jing. And so there's so much allocation that goes
mhm.
towards creating life. And so that's why so many traditional peoples had ways to deeply, deeply care for the mothers when they're in postpartum. There's so many traditional practices all over the world that have kind of fallen away now that kind of Western medicine has kind of taken over midwifery practices. Yeah, so usually now it's you get, you can just like kind of leave the hospital after a day, no monitoring, no real advice on how to take care of yourself. And you come back in 6 weeks and have like the check to engage in sex again.
Hmm.
And that's kind of it. Yeah. So there's a real emphasis, especially in East Asian medicine, to replenish Jing because there's such a big loss in postpartum. And then at the third one, the third golden opportunity is perimenopause. And that's where we're kind of shifting wheels in the life cycles to where if we think of menarche as like our entrance into our reproductive cycles, perimenopause is our journey out of them.
Mm.
So meeting that shift and that change is most definitely a rite of passage. Yeah.
Yeah, I find it so fascinating. Like, I freaking love being a woman. And the more I deepen into like my physiology and just because I couldn't relate to my body before. I didn't know how to be honest. I think a lot of the wellness culture speaks to a lot of like learning, like there's a lot of language about loving yourself, but how do we learn to know ourselves? And if we don't really
Mm,
know something, it might be hard to really know what love would feel like. To love your liver. Like I'm in this process, like I'm thinking of like my liver because so much of my blood work after I lost a lot of blood with my second birth reflected like my liver needed my attention. And
mm,
that's from a Western lens. And then when I kind of started to get curious from a Chinese medicine perspective, I started to look into like the energetics behind it. Like I learned that liver holds a lot of anger. I think it was anger. And so I started to look at it from a lens of do I have repressed anger? I mean, not only are you birthing a baby when you're becoming a mother, but you're also birthing yourself. And yeah, it's tender, right? And it doesn't happen like in the 6 weeks allocation that we get in Western medicine. It reminds me of like when you look at divorce rates, 50% of people get divorced. We will invest so much into throwing this ceremony, but are we really investing on what happens after? Like,
mm,
and it's not women's fault either. Like when it comes to postpartum, I'm thinking of my own experience because all the things I learned, I had to choose to learn on my own. It wasn't like readily available in the system. And it was so empowering and so beautiful, but also disruptive to learn that there's a whole existence of like traditional cultures where they revere the mother. And yes, the baby's so important. And all the practices you speak of, I feel like are more mother focused. Because if the mother is not well, if like you think of a garden, if the soil through which your blossoming harvest isn't well, then are we really looking at what's inside? And the continuum of that health is lending from the health of the mother. And I think of
mm.
myself and just how like it was such a wild journey. I'm still in it. My daughter, she's going to be 2 in March, but I've learned also that it takes up to 2 years on an internal level for the mother to, I don't even want to use the word normal because are you ever like, what is normal after motherhood? It's a whole, like, we've never done it before, right? Like, every time you birth a life, you're not the same as you were before the first life. Like, there's so much expansion on every level. And so, I love what you shared about how in a lot of other cultures, there is a huge focus on that postpartum period. And just to circle back to the original thing of what we're exploring here, the Jing essence, you mentioned, are we living a Jing centered life? And that's something I wrote down as something I want to explore with you. So I love that you said it. I would love to know from you as a practitioner of Chinese medicine, what does it mean to live a Jing centered life? You mentioned in the golden opportunities, like you don't want to lose too much Jing. And yet, like for some of our listeners, they might not even know. I'm still learning what does it mean and what does it feel like to live a Jing essence life?
We need bumper stickers that say that.
Yeah.
T-shirts. Living a Jing centered life is understanding that there's always going to be loss in order to keep life cycles going, the life, death, rebirth cycle going and going. We can't perpetually build and accumulate. We need
Mhm.
some loss. And so Jing allocates itself throughout our lifespan, but we have so much influence in how much and how fast we're allocating that Jing.
Mm-hmm.
And so if we were to hone in on our monthly menstrual cycles, it's kind of a fatty way to say it nowadays, but like the cycle syncing. I remember talking about it like almost like 10 years ago, and now it feels like it's more common,
Mm-hmm.
which is amazing. But it's not like a fad. It's very much from all traditional practices that
Mm-hmm.
realize that we are so connected to nature. The timing, the rhythms, the day night cycles, like light and dark, our bodies are so affected by that. The tides of the moon and its effect on water. And so cycle syncing really is getting to know your cyclical nature and realizing that as a dynamic body, we change quite a bit within a month's time.
Mm-hmm.
And so, what that really essentially requires is leaning into that a bit instead of pushing through or overriding or hacking our way through it. It's really kind of honoring like the voice and the language of our bodies
Mm-hmm.
instead of like the mind over body. It's more how can we listen to what the body has to say and then maybe try to align to that as much as possible. Yeah, so during our bleeding time, we are actually pretty vulnerable. We have a few vulnerabilities within East Asian medicine. There's an opening that happens that allows the shedding to happen. So, with that opening, we are susceptible to cold, we're
Mm.
susceptible to wind, and we're in a relative blood deficiency.
Right.
So, during our bleeding days, that's kind of like our inner winter time
Mm-hmm.
where the body is just really asking for a bit more rest
Mm-hmm.
because hormones are at its lowest. So the message really is, can I rest a little bit more? Can I go internal a little bit more and tend to what's closest to me? Can I protect myself more during this time
Mm-hmm.
when you're a bit more vulnerable? And so it could just start really there. Because I think when we learn about the whole cycle, the whole menstrual cycle, we'll learn that there's like four distinct changes
Mm-hmm.
that happen. And so sometimes that can feel a little overwhelming. Like, oh, wow, I have to do different things at different times of the month. But I like to just start with the bleeding phase. If during your bleeding days, you can just pull back like a few percentages each month and just start to notice how you come into that next phase after your bleeding days and just start to
Mm-hmm.
kind of notice how you're feeling. You might notice that you need more rest,
Right.
sleeping more, taking naps, noticing that you're a bit more colder, that your limbs are colder, your low back feels cold. So it's just starting to kind of tune in to the body's messages during the bleeding days is an amazing beginning to start to relate to your cyclical nature. And that's living a Jing centered life. That's one step into it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It sounds like through the theme of what you just shared, it just sounds like that tuning in, like creating coherence with what's happening on the inside. And I've heard before during your bleed that a woman is very the most intuitive that she'll ever be compared to like the rest of her infradian cycle. I'm curious from your perspective, is that true? Or and if that is true, why is that true? Is it because we're more rested so technically we notice more? That's what I've felt for myself anyway.
Yeah. I think it can be. But what dominant culture tells us to do is to be productive all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And so I wonder if we rob ourselves of that realization that we have the capacity for intuition,
Mm-hmm.
but we push through it. We address more of what's on the outside all the time. And so there's almost like this avoidance to go within and to connect with what's within and closest to us by tending to everything on the outside and doing all the time, to where we're not creating that space to really connect with that capacity. So I think we can connect with that aspect of the self. It does exist there because that's like the realm of water. The kind of
Mm.
wintry water that's the realm of the ancestors. And so if we do quiet down, if we do listen beyond the ears and listen with our senses, that intuition can be super, super potent during that time.
Yeah, that's so true. And I'm wondering for you if this was something you grew up knowing and then you had your first bleed and it was like you tended to yourself in that way during your bleed, or was it something that happened as a result of following the path of becoming a Chinese medicine practitioner? Like, I would love to know more of how this all intersected with your life because you teach it so beautifully.
Yeah, I think if I were to think back, it was a bit fragmented, I think, when I was younger. And I think it's because my mom is from South Korea. And so a lot of the things that I've learned are like little bits and pieces from what she's learned.
Hmm.
But with her moving to the US and being kind of cut off from family by miles and miles, I think there was a deep need for my mom to assimilate.
Hmm.
And I think because of that, it did feel a bit fragmented. The sharing of the knowledge, I guess, felt kind of mixed and blended. Um, yeah, so it doesn't feel like kind of complete as far as like
Hmm.
the foundations, but the curiosities were always there. I just remember like herbs being cooked, and if I had a belly ache, my grandma would like wrap like a string around my finger and prick my, fingertip because that releases heat. Yeah, so like things like that really kind of imprinted really early
Hmm.
on. And so there was always this kind of curiosity, like, what is that? Where
Yeah.
is this knowledge coming from? What is it rooted in?
Yes.
And yeah, with Korea, they, of course, are a land that has been colonized a lot by a lot of bigger powers. And so one of them being China. So the medicine practiced in Korea was a blend of Korean traditional medicine plus Chinese medicine.
Okay.
And yeah, so then when I started to, know more about myself and what I wanted to do in the world, it didn't come until like my late 20s. And so then that's when I entered acupuncture school and things started to kind of fill in the gap
Mm.
of kind of what the little things that I did learn early on. And it just kind of filled in the story
Hmm.
essentially. And it still keeps on building upon itself because the learning is literally
Endless.
endless. Yeah.
I love that. So that brings up a question for me to circle back to Jing essence, how you were speaking to that blood is in our ancestry as well. Would you
Mhm.
say it's true or accurate that, say, someone is like drawn to a certain path of interest and it doesn't make sense to them on a material level because it wasn't something they were always exposed to, but the feeling feels so resonant in the body? So I guess my question is like, can our ancestry or that blood that is our Jing sort of inform the path that unfolds before us? And, I always say our mind takes longer to catch up with what the body already knows. And because, like in my own experience, I feel like I'm drawn to so much holistic practices and just traditional ancient wisdom. And it doesn't quite make sense to me because a lot of people in my family, like there are medical doctors and there's nurses, and that's great. That's one realm of things, but I feel very at home with some of this stuff, but I don't know where it comes from. And it might bring the question of like, that's something for me to explore. But I'm curious from your perspective, would that blood that runs through us and the blood that helps create life through our kin, do you feel like it contains that information that might be like, this feels so good to learn, but I don't quite understand why yet?
Yeah, I feel like you're speaking to like the realms of like destiny or
Yes, exactly.
yeah. Yeah, I'm fully admitting that I don't know too much about it, but
Mhm.
Jing, what I do know about Jing is that we bring it through our entire lineage. And
Mhm.
of course, we know this through, of course, the maternal lineage, right? Is like your grandma had basically you,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
In
So
utero.
it
Yeah.
kind of carries on. And that pre-heaven essence or the pre-heaven Jing brings everything along with it. And so I do feel like there are certain individuals that, hmm, maybe you've heard of this before, but have like this role essentially to play to either break pattern or
Yes.
to rekindle um, ancestral wisdom. Yeah, and it might be that you are that person as far as like as the generations go
Mhm.
on. Yeah, and it really does feel like you are the best person to know that, especially
Mhm.
if that curiosity is there. And I love how you use the word resonance. So
Mm.
resonance has this quality of like expansion to me. And so
Mhm.
if you sit with it and it feels just expansive, I feel like that's kind of a message. That is some kind of vibration that is, it's like a tuning fork. Like it feels like it's
Yeah.
resonant, like it's connecting. It feels right. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. The way I describe what comes up for me as I want to say follow my heart, even when my mind like wants to logically debunk things sometimes. It feels like it's calling me. Like it's like I don't even have like I know I have a choice, but I don't have a choice. It's like this thing that's like it wakes me up at night and she's encouraging this energy wants me to get to know it. And as I get to know it, it's also getting to know me. So there's this like reciprocity happening. And I think
Ooh.
that's why I really love Chinese medicine because it's not like you're having pain under your rib, here's some medication. It's like my acupuncturist was like, "Are you holding on to anger?" And I'm like no one's really ever asked me that before, which leads me into my next question, something you posted about pounds can be our ally. And
Mm.
what happened with me postpartum is like, I mean, come on, everyone has postpartum weight, but also like when you're about to bleed, like your body is just keeping you extra warm. So we feel bloated, things like that, you know? And, but what I noticed with my liver when I started to be in dialogue with it and really exploring, like, is there something I'm holding that I'm not addressing? Because I really believe in the power of like the subconscious happenings below the mind, right? And it was interesting because when I addressed the things that I might be angry about, and it wasn't even like anything big, it was like this lesson of life is happening in the mundane and it's the little things through which add up that can become this big thing energetically, and then our bodies just, I get chills when I
Hmm.
think about how much it loves us, that it will prioritize our survival over thrival, that if our mind's not willing to acknowledge it, our body will hold it for us. Like, isn't that just a fucking miracle?
Amazing.
It's
Yeah.
so amazing. And so when I went to my liver, I was like, what's happening? And I started to look up, like, there's a book by Paul Richford, I believe, and it has like all these herbs and things that you could eat to support your organs. And there's just this like reverence for the interconnection. Like when you're
Mm.
treating the liver is like if you're not addressing your anger, it's also going to compensate for your fear, or like the kidneys and like all the surrounding organs. But what I learned from it was when I addressed what I was feeling angry about, it was as if it didn't have to work so hard for me anymore. And then like the feedback I
Mm,
got was a shedding of weight, and not weight from this like physical, what's the word, like aesthetic point of view, but just feeling heavy with emotion. And it was like starting to eat foods that would support my liver. And then there was like this opening, and it felt
mm,
really cool to know that I could engage with my body that way. And I didn't know this until I started looking at it from like a Chinese medicine perspective lens. So I just think that's so cool, because a lot of the dialogue between my acupuncturist and I like to see her for 5 element acupuncture. So it goes a little bit deeper and looks beyond the surface. It really taught me a lot about just the whole ecosystem that exists. Like our bodies are literally living, breathing gardens in and of itself. And it's
mm.
amazing the way it thanks us when we nourish it in the way that it needs. Sort of like raising
Right.
ourselves or our children, right? So
Yeah.
I'm curious for you, when you say pounds can be an ally, and I don't remember what it was speaking to specifically, but I remember seeing it and thinking like, yeah, I feel like my weight and my anger became my ally, because it wasn't the thing I wanted to block out, even though I was doing that before. It became the thing that I wanted to enter into and lean into, as you were saying at the start. So, how can pounds be our ally? Because I find for so many women, this is like the never ending climb of, I want to lose the last 10 pounds. I want to, I feel fat. I feel heavy. Like all of this language that takes away from the wisdom of why that weight is there in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, it's literal cushion for a journey. That's how I see it. Yeah, and the post that I made was in reference to perimenopause, because I think
Okay.
a lot of the messaging out there is lose your menopausal belly kind of a thing. And so there is this trend as we transition from our kind of reproductive years into um, our middle perimenopausal years, and the body's ability to make these adjustments that it needs to make in order to help us through this journey.
Mm-hmm.
And so, what I notice in a lot of my patients is that that's like the goal at that time is like, hey, I'm working out like normal. I'm eating the same healthy way, but I've gained like these 10 pounds that I just can't lose no matter how hard I work out, no matter
Mm-hmm.
how many calories that I restrict. And so it really becomes this conversation about, well, let's build some context for understanding what your body is going through right now and
Mm-hmm.
maybe why your body is hanging on to them. And so, what we know about that transition is that lots of things are changing. The body's ability to build qi and blood really slows down during that time.
Mm-hmm.
So, qi and blood you can think about as like hormones.
Mm-hmm.
And so the hormone production really starts to change. And so, in essence, your body is responding to that, saying, okay, there's this natural loss that has to happen in order to move us through this journey of coming out of our reproductive cycles. How are we going to cushion you through this change of so much loss? Because the
Mm-hmm.
loss is going to happen over sometimes like 7 to 10 years for some of us, this whole
Mm-hmm.
perimenopausal journey. Yeah. And so instead of looking at it through like a pathological lens, how can we shift our understanding to understand what the body is doing for itself in order to survive this journey? And so it's like this literal cushion. And so, what we know about perimenopause is that usually progesterone starts to go down first. And then, as you kind of journey along, then estrogen starts to go down. And so, the body, in a way, is like, well, how do I continue to produce these things on my own? And so, another way that your body produces its own estrogen is through storage. And
Mm-hmm.
so, in a way, the body is acclimating to that. So, if you're kind of working against your body and you're like, I need to shed this like extra 10 pounds and you're
Mhm.
restricting calories and you're working out a lot. Um, the reason those things are not kind of falling off is because you're almost kind of stressing your body a bit more.
Mhm.
Your body is already sensitive to stress during this time. And so by working out more, that sends like signals of stress to the body. By restricting calories, that sends, stress to the body. And so we're kind of working against our goals of trying to lose the weight and almost like adding on even more weight because you're
Mhm.
putting your body in like survival kind of stress mode
Right.
to where essentially your thyroid is like, we're going to slow everything down because I don't know when I'm going to be out of this stress. Yeah, so there's sometimes an intelligence to shifting weight, even within like a calendar year.
Mhm.
Maybe in the winter time, we gain a few pounds to kind of help buffer us and cushion us during the kind of harsher winter season and to really deeply nourish everything so that we can come into springtime like really rooted in.
Yeah.
And then things start to fluctuate throughout the year. And then, as you mentioned, there's other times where the body kind of cushions in order to protect us. Maybe it might be emotional, maybe it might be trauma. Yeah. And so it's about getting curious about where is the body's intelligence in putting
Mhm.
the pounds on.
Yeah. I love that. I find it's endless, like what you were saying before. It's such an endless, I mean, most women wouldn't call it adventurous, but I feel like it might take the pressure off a little bit because admittedly, I'm definitely someone that was like, "Oh, I wanna lose the postpartum weight, and I wanna" there's all these things, and yet here I am still breastfeeding, and I still don't feel fully in my body, but I feel as fully in my body as I can be for this stage of my life. So this brings up the question for me. There was a quote I saw by Dr. Claudia Welch, and she's Ayurveda, and I think she does Chinese medicine as well. She's got this awesome book called Balance Your Life, Balance Your Hormones. And she posted a quote that said something about, like, I might get it wrong, but it was along the lines of sometimes it takes years of study and years of experience to realize the power of going back to the basics and the wisdom in that.
Mm.
And so I would love to know from your experience with working with patients and from teaching these beautiful lessons on how we could cultivate healthy relationship with our body and nature. What are some basic fundamental things for a woman? I know you mentioned before, like start with your bleed, but maybe you could speak a little bit to within the bleed, like how are some ways when it's not accessible? Like one thing that comes to me is like I love to wear wool socks during my bleed because I know that it helps keep my womb warm, and it's probably not the time for me to drink smoothies like cold fruit. So yeah, what are some basic things that are like basic yet powerful in how we weave them into our life?
Okay. When it comes to like just like the basics, our bodies are they are dynamic, but they're not complicated in
Mhm.
like what they need.
Mhm.
Yeah, so it's almost like if we can just give space to what the body needs. And instead of like mind over body, how can we lean into what the body needs? So, what the body needs is lots of affection, sleep, nourishment, and play.
Yes.
Those are the basics.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And so where are the maps? The maps are, of course, within our body, but it's also around us all the time. So tuning into what season it is, that is so informative.
Yes.
So with it being winter time, it is a time to kind of rest a bit more, get more sleep. When the sun is out, just infuse your body with all of that yang energy, enjoying like nourishing, warm foods. Yeah, so that's kind of like how to tune into the basics is pay attention to what nature is doing and
Mm.
then see what it would feel like to just kind of align with that a little bit.
I love that.
Yeah.
So, what would you say though to someone that lives on the other side of the equator, like someone that lives in Australia where it's like summer all the time?
Yeah. Um, yeah, I just talked to somebody over email who lives in Australia, and I was like, how is it over there? I know it's like summertime.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then I have a friend who lives in Chile, and yeah, so they have like the holidays in June and so forth. So,
Hmm.
um, mm, I mean, it's still seasonal. It just maybe on like the actual dates will be different, but
Yeah.
the sensory input that you receive from your environment is information.
Yeah.
Yeah, so either it be your summer there and our winter here, how can you just observe, what the weather feels like on your skin when you walk out the door?
Yeah.
Is it a little bit breezy and chilly? Maybe we can put some overcoat on and make sure that we're not exposed to too much wind and cold. Yeah, when it's nice and sunny outside, are we staying inside? Are we going outside to play? Those types of things.
Yeah, it's so true. Like even when my kids are under the weather, I almost immediately they'll feel better if I bring them outside in the sun a little bit because there's obviously some source of energy and vitamins that they're getting from the sun, which can be really counterintuitive when we're told to like lather up in sunscreen and like don't be directly exposed
Hmm.
to the sun. And I know that's like a whole other podcast episode, but yeah, it's just interesting to notice the feedback though, like it
Yeah.
feels good to receive nature in her ways.
Hmm.
And I just wanted to explore with you too, like there was also something you posted that I wanted to go to and I wrote it down actually. It says midlife is full of magic. And perhaps because I feel like if I am fortunate enough to live to my 90s, I'm 41 now, but like, I've decided I want to live, like I want to meet my grandchildren and I started motherhood late, but it's like it in a lot of ways it feels like a rebirth being in my 40s now with the wisdom I've integrated into my life and it feels like I'm in my second adolescent stage, but I get to make more empowering choices. So from your experience, I'd love to know A, what it feels like to have magic in your life if you have an example of that. Emojis. And B, why you feel like midlife is full of magic. I love your mug, by the way.
Yeah, it says plant person inside my cup.
So cute.
Why is midlife full of magic?
Mhm.
So I would say my 20s, there are so many insecurities and questioning of am I good enough or am I too much,
Mm,
being like such a sensitive person. Yeah, and then 30s were hard. That was a hard decade where there were lots of health challenges, immense amount of stress. Yeah, and then something happened when I turned 40, uh, where almost like these outside influence didn't hold so much weight.
mm,
And there was a coming home type of feeling
yeah.
where I'm like, there you are, kind of
Mm,
a thing. And I'm okay with who you are. And you have faults and you have so much heart and it's super complex, but it's you and I love you and I see you. Yeah, so it just felt like a coming home.
yeah.
And of course that relationship with self is still evolving.
Mhm.
And that's kind of a necessity in our middle years. It's like a mirror that's being held up to ourselves to be like, hey, I know that what's happening outside of you, there's lots of important things, but you are also important. You're
Mhm.
an part of the equation. And almost like it's like this permission. It's like it's okay that you also take care of yourself,
Yeah.
kind of a message. Yeah.
Which is really magical to receive.
Yeah, and it is a natural kind of impetus that happens. So the elements are really carrying that for you.
Mm,
So the element before metal is earth. And so earth is kind of what we call our reproductive years. And this is where we start to build home and community, and there's just lots of abundance there. And then as we kind of transition from earth to metal, so essentially into perimenopause, there's a real sense that we can't perpetually accumulate. And
mm.
so, what needs letting go? What are you holding on to that's just too much to carry right now? How can we free up some of your energy? Yeah. So it's a nice impetus to
Yeah.
ride.
That
Yeah.
reminds me of Dr. Claudia Welch's medicine of subtraction. Yeah,
Yes.
and we never think of it that way because we live in like there's a big capitalist message that we need to consume and buy a lot of things and there's a lot of instant gratification. And it makes me think of what you were speaking to earlier about starting with our bleed and how it's a time to rest and slow down. And what I learned in practicing that, I mean, I still need to practice that. I notice when I schedule these conversations, I try not to put them like in the hub of my bleed, like only on the upswing, but there's a huge difference. I've had the conversations during my bleed and like words are tripping out of my head. Like I can't find the words. I'm like, oh my God, I can't even form a sentence right now. Like it's so strange. It's like the wisdom of the body. Like
Mm,
this is not the time to be having this important conversation. Thank God for
mm.
grace and, um,
Yes.
learning that slow is actually more because it invites you to notice more and take in more of what's around you and within you, and it's like this beautiful slow cooking of presence and noticing how,
Hmm.
like, how the current beliefs we're carrying is mirroring our availability to the world and ourselves, and so I just love that. And I'm curious for
Hmm.
you with the Way of Yin. I don't know if I ever told you this, and just naming the time that we've got like 10 minutes. But the last thing I wanted to explore with you is sort of the genesis of the Way of Yin. The reason I found you is because I was creating Ritual of Wild and I was really looking for sort of inspiration as to how, what did this feel like the imagery. And somehow your logo was in my Pinterest search. And I was so in love with it. And then I clicked on it and I visited your site. I'm like, who is this Kris González? Like, what is the Way of Yin? And this began my journey of like, I wanted to learn more about you and what you created because it felt so good to receive in my body, just the like the nectar you were teaching about. And I thought it was so
Oh.
cool to be like sitting there and just through the imagery that you had attached with the Way of Yin, it was so inviting, like again, like a calling
Mm.
in. So I'd love to know as we wrap up, speaking of birth, life, death cycles, what is most alive for you in the Way of Yin? And what is your living prayer through this baby that you've birthed into the world creatively?
Gosh, your questions are just so like I can feel myself just kind of drawing in, and it feels so good to just draw in.
I'm glad.
I'm loving the word that you used earlier about grace.
Mm,
Because with everything that we've talked about, it's not about perfection.
mhm,
There's no such thing. And I think that's what I brush up against a lot. I think in working with patients for a while now is that there is some type of perfection that people are trying to reach. And it's just a reminder that we are human and
mhm,
we're relating all of the time, relating to ourselves, relating to each other. And so, if we're striving for perfection, that's just going to be really hard and so
mm,
much pressure. And so really the way of yin is an invitation to like be okay with this dynamic experience of being in a cyclical body.
Hmm.
With all the kind of big tides and low tides, that it's such a gift to be able to experience sensation. And yeah, and the yin part is the container to be able to experience all of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love that. And certainly, like, I felt like as I learned through maidens and menstruation, like your teaching style is very nurturing. Like it's a very welcoming energy. So I can certainly feel that integrous with your mission with the Way of Yin. And maybe you can let people know what's up and coming through the Way of Yin and how they can find you.
Yeah. So yeah, the wayofyin.com is kind of the easiest way to connect. And there's lots of resources and, seasonal kind of cyclical wisdom within the blog. Each year I have like two major offerings, which is like the Maidens in Menstruation offering, where we get to teach our young within circles within our communities about how to relate to their cyclical bodies and to, see their menstrual cycles as like a barometer of health. And the other big offering is When Earth Bears Metal, which is all about navigating perimenopause through like the rich lens of East Asian medicine
Mhm.
and all the alchemy that happens and the unraveling. Yeah, and then I team up with two other amazing practitioners, Marissa Correa, who's a somatic experiencing practitioner, and then Dr. Jivan Singh, who's also an East Asian medicine practitioner and also a somatic womb worker.
Mm.
And we offer a 9-month certification program for healing practitioners called the Somatic Womb Path. And ooh, yeah, if the womb was a place, somatic womb work is really like the language that's spoken there. And so this is really a program about relating to ourselves as healing practitioners, including our healing within our client sessions and recognizing that we are also human, having these human experiences, and that we're such an integral part of that space holding, essentially.
Yeah.
So that's something that we offer as well.
Amazing. And your Instagram page is at the Way of Yin, right?
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's so much beautiful information on Chris's page. So you could go on over there to check out the resources, and just everything she speaks to is really, I find it so fascinating. Like a love language for the womb and our bodies, really. It's really cool.
Yay.
Kris, thank you so much for coming on. I feel like this was medicine for me to receive, being in dialogue with you.
Same.
And I so look forward to continuing learning alongside you and from you, and just really appreciate you in the world.
Thank you so much. This felt like such right timing. I can't say that enough. It felt such like good timing. Yeah.
So glad. Okay. We will look out for
Yay.
you on the media platforms, and we'll stay connected.
Okay. Take
Thank
care, love.
you. Thank you.